I kind of just do what I love now, and I research food, I cook food, I film it, and I put it online, and it usually gets received well. So I think it's so different from where I thought my life and career would go.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. The internet has changed many things, and when it comes to food, social media has opened the kitchen door, using a new lens on food, and with some, by luck, good fortune, or a clever approach, it's changed their lives. Andy Hearnden is a professional chef and better known these days as Andy Cooks. Andy, how are you?
I'm good, Huck. How are you?
I'm good. You've spent the vast majority of your career, like many chefs, slaving away in commercial kitchens, and now we're seeing your face everywhere. What's the shift been like?
It's been life-changing, to be honest, but in a positive way.
It's been a pretty interesting period of time and very challenging for many, but you're sort of saying the shift has been very positive for you. When did that shift change, and tell us a bit about it?
Yeah, well, it was like for most people when COVID hit. I was living and working in Melbourne and lost my job pretty quickly. So we kind of packed up and drove north to the Sunshine Coast where my partner's from. And I kind of sat around for 6 months licking my wounds and then realised that we just needed to get on. And I thought I'd give this content thing a crack. And it's turned out pretty well.
Did you ever think that it would go to where it's gone? Like, obviously, it was a pretty scary time and a time to change new things, but what led you down that path?
I think I've always been a big consumer of content. And I was always, listen to lots of podcasts, always, I was always on Instagram, always watching YouTube. And I kind of saw, a few people really making, decent careers out of it in the US and Europe. And I thought that's where I'd wanted to head.
It's an interesting change. How much has your cooking changed from that sort of professional chef to being in front of a camera?
Oh, it's massively, and I think from the angle I chose to choose with my content was through the eye of a professional chef who's learning how to be a good home cook, because they're really different. They're very different mediums of cooking. So I kind of made an active decision to show it warts and all, and show where I made mistakes and where I had some wins. But being stuck and locked into my apartment in Melbourne at the start, and I hadn't actually cooked at home much my whole life, like most chefs. I never really cooked at home. So all of a sudden, trying to figure out how to use a domestic kitchen, it was a pretty funny exercise.
Do you have any stories of that shift? Shifting from thinking of being a chef and cooking that way in a restaurant from lots of people to that, in the home sort of cooking. Were there some bumps along the road you can tell us about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the most obvious one is just like the amount that I was cooking. I kept cooking for me and Caitlin, my partner, and there'd just be this ridiculous amount of food. And then the other issues I kept coming up with was just the lack of heat and in my domestic appliances. So just trying to kind of get my head around, wrap my head around that was pretty challenging.
Well, I want to explore your cooking and sort of how your life has changed in greater detail a bit later on, but you spent the majority of your career as a professional chef. Take us back to when you were young. Where did you grow up, and what sort of role did food play for you and your family?
Yeah, so I was born in Wellington, and all my family on my mother's side were poultry farmers in New Zealand. So food was always, in the centre of the table, and we ate together as a family. And I was exposed to how food was produced at a very young age. So, I was, like most kind of people growing up in city, I had the exposure of actually going to big farms and understanding how the food got to the plate. So, that was a pretty formidable part of my life, in hindsight. And then I always wanted to be a chef. That was my only ever, when I was a kid, anyone ever asked me what I wanted to do, it was always to be a chef. So as soon as I could leave school, I left school and went to chef's college in Auckland, which was, it was pretty interesting. I think food back in the early 2000s in New Zealand, and probably likewise Australia, wasn't definitely what it is now. And like most people of that generation, I couldn't wait to get out of New Zealand. So as soon as I could, I got to London, and that's where I kind of say that I really learned how to cook. I'm sure there was good restaurants in this part of the world at that time, but they were very far and few between, and London's food scene was really kind of popping off at that point. So
before we talk about London, take us back to Auckland. You were young when you moved away from Wellington to Auckland and started your career. What was it like for you working in the commercial kitchen and being so young?
Yeah, we moved to Auckland when I was about 10 as a family, and then I left school at 16 and went straight into chef school, and I think the biggest learning for me at that point was learning how to manage my own time and learning how to have autonomy, I guess. 16 is pretty young to be set free in the world, but I managed through it. I think growing up on the farm, I had a pretty good work ethic, so I knew how to work hard and I knew how to hustle. And then I kind of started in the Auckland cafe scene straight out of chef's college, which taught me how to work fast. And you kind of talk about the cafe scenes to people outside of this part of the world, and they don't quite understand how serious Kiwis and Aussies take their breakfasts. But it taught me how to poach an egg and how to be really quick. So
take us to London. Were you shocked at sort of how different it was to what you were used to?
Yeah, I probably was. I was probably shocked at the workload or the amount of hours that we were working, and it was just a very different environment. The kitchens were pretty aggressive. They were very driven. Luckily, I kind of respond well to that type of pressure, but it's certainly not for everyone. And it's also changing now, which is good. But it was a shock to the system to kind of be, told pretty quickly and abruptly that you've made a mistake, and far fewer and more aggressive words.
In your time in London, what were the sort of really important people and venues that helped build your career?
So when I first got to London, I went and worked for a chef by the name of Tom Atkins, and at his restaurant Tom's Kitchen in Chelsea, and that was a very I didn't really know where I'd landed. But it was a very, good restaurant. Tom was a pretty formidable chef, pretty well known for a lot of good things, and also known to be pretty tough. So I think having that restaurant on my CV really opened up a lot of doors from there. So I did, a year and a half with Tom, and then I kind of went to a few other spots, including a restaurant called E&O in Notting Hill. And then when I was in that restaurant group, I got my first head chef job at like 24, which was, really, really young. And that was at a restaurant called the Great Eastern Dining Room in Shoreditch. And I think that was another really, a big leap in my career, and probably actually for the wrong way. I think I got given way too much responsibility at a younger age, and probably wasn't ready for that role. But it's good. I think it kind of chewed me up and spat me out, and it kind of made me realise, what it was to be a head chef wasn't just the glorified stuff that you see. There's a lot to it. And all of a sudden you're having to actually manage people and manage a team. And at the end of the day, I think running kitchens is actually, it's 10% creative and 90% managing people. So.
Looking back at the head chef that you were then and to now, like how did you cope with that sort of shift of not just creating dishes but managing people? Are you vastly different?
Yeah, I changed pretty quickly. I went into that head chef role and imitated management behaviour that I'd witnessed my whole career, or my career in London, and it actually, it took me a few years to realise that that's actually not my personality and how I manage people, and it's actually pretty unproductive in most cases. So I learned that the hard way, but it kind of grew me as a person because it forced me to realise, when you're standing at a service and half the brigade's not showing up and you're going scratching your head wondering why, and then you look back and you go, well, you weren't treating people right. It's a tough lesson to learn, but probably pretty important. So I was pretty glad to kind of figure out who I was as a person at a relatively young age, and it was through making a lot of mistakes pretty early. So,
you mentioned it near the top of the show about how London was so important for you in regards to building your career and becoming a chef. What did you take from your time in London? What was it that you learnt from that experience?
I think the key thing, I always say I learned how to cook in London, and I think that's really true. And it's just learning those fundamental, French techniques, how to actually, manage mise en place, how to kind of, run a kitchen, I guess, as opposed to, the cafe work and stuff that I'd done in New Zealand before. It was very much day to day. You show up, you kind of get the kitchen open and you punch out some food and you go home, whereas it was far more planning. And so, yeah, I think London, in simplest terms, really taught me how to cook and how to be a professional.
What brought you back to this side of the planet?
I was in London for 7 years, and London, I have a huge place in my heart for that city, but it's very tough. It's dark and cold. And unless you're kind of earning decent money, I think it's a hard city to live in. And chefs don't earn decent money, so it made it tricky. And I think it's just that realization that you kind of want to be able to be closer to home. Even though I never went back to New Zealand, I wanted to be 3 or 4 hours away as opposed to 24 hours away. Yeah, so I think it's just the family, get it closer to family and a bit of lifestyle as well.
What was life like for you when you landed in Australia?
So I went to Sydney, and I didn't love it, to be honest. I struggled with Sydney at that time. I thought the food scene wasn't great. This is over 10 years ago now. The food scene was kind of a bit hollow and a bit soulless. The working environments were very different. People didn't work quite as hard as I think they did in London, and I kind of struggled with that. So I only lasted about 9-10 months in Sydney before I moved to Melbourne. But yeah, and I think on that, I think Sydney's food scene has changed, dramatically. And now I as a proud Melburnian, I would say that Sydney's food scene right now is probably better than Melbourne's, to be honest.
Wow. Yeah. Tell us about that move to Melbourne. What was it about Melbourne, and what was it like for you when you got there?
I think Melbourne's just it's as close as you're going to get to a European city outside of Europe. The food culture when I got to Melbourne was fantastic. The community of chefs was incredible. And bartenders and the small hole in the walls and the good cafes, and it was just vibrant. People were trying different things. People weren't scared to try things. And, the food community is just fantastic in Melbourne. It always kind of has been. So I loved it. I absolutely love Melbourne.
Where did you get your foot in the door in Melbourne?
I started at a restaurant called Gill's Diner, which I'm sure you've eaten at before. Fantastic little restaurant, bakery attached, had free reign pretty much on the menu, and that's kind of where I grew my love for baking as well. The bakery, and we're producing some great bread for all of, a lot of really cool spots, and the European and City Wine Shop and all that. So so that's where I started at Gill's Diner before they sold that restaurant, and it turned into the Italian restaurant that it is now. So I did a bit of a handover with those guys, and then realised that it was two chefs and a front of house person that brought it. So it was pretty. It was no space for me there. That's for sure.
You spent a lot of your career in Melbourne. What's been the real sort of key venues and people that you've worked with?
I think that was definitely, what kicked my career off there. And then I did a few other things. I opened the Entrecôte next to in the city there, and next to where Stokehouse was, which was a really cool restaurant. But I think that laneway's kind of jinxed, or I don't know. I don't think I've ever seen a successful restaurant in that laneway for some reason. And then I went and worked for St. Ali for quite a while, and was their executive chef. Running the main St. Ali and then looking after the food program for all the other spots. So, and really enjoyed my time there. So,
what was the role there? Take us through that.
So I was the executive chef for the company. Obviously, the main role was to make sure that the flagship, the South Melbourne Cafe, was running, and that's where I spent most of my time. But that was and still is, that spot was an absolute beast. We'd do 1,000 covers for breakfast and the weekends. Yeah. So like a monster, and at a really high level for a cafe. And then I had a little bit to do with the St. Ali's that opened over in Jakarta. And then we looked after, we had acquired auction rooms at some point near the end of my tenure there, and just to kind of make sure that all those, there's as much synergy as possible between the cafes.
We've had Salvatore Malatesta on the show before. Do you have any stories of what it's like working with him?
Sal is like, honestly, once you're in Sal's team, he's one of the most loyal and decent human beings I've ever met. I still speak to Sal frequently, but he's the epitome of an entrepreneur. So he's a madman, and I'd say that to his face. He's got 1,000 ideas, and his brain goes 10,000 miles an hour. So it's pretty full on, especially when you're working in one of those roles that you're working closely with him. He kind of has an idea, and you need to kind of try and execute it as fast as you can. But yeah, an extremely loyal human being. But yeah, he can be, he's a classic entrepreneur where he has 1,000 ideas and wants you to execute them in 3 minutes.
At the top of the show, you talked about sort of losing your job at the beginning of COVID and heading north. Tell us what you were doing in Melbourne and what that period of time was like for you. How did you feel?
Yeah, so I left St. Ali. Well, actually, I kind of had a little spat at rehab, not a spat. I went to rehab from St. Ali, and those guys were super supportive through my journey of recovery. And I still had a job with them throughout the whole thing. And then once I'd kind of come back and I was kind of easing back into work after a couple of months off trying to look after myself, I got approached by a big company called Emirates Leisure Retail, which was a subsidiary of the airline, and we had over 100 venues around Australia and New Zealand, mainly based in airports. So I took over their exec chef role and kind of the head of food and beverage role, which, it was pretty tough to leave St. Ali because they'd treated me so well through my darkest days. But I kind of needed to, get out, and I was pretty keen to explore some of those big corporate exec chef roles. I've always kind of planned in the last 5 years of my actual cooking career. It's like I need to get off this line. I can't run it past my whole life. I think it was for me, I wasn't cut out for I didn't want to be in my 40s or 50s still kind of running a pass at a restaurant. That wasn't something I desired to do. So I kind of actively started looking for big corporate exec chef roles. So I was there for 2.5 years before COVID hit, and a really varied role that sent me all over the world, and all over the country and all over New Zealand. I'd do easily 100 flights a year. It was just always on the road. Really, I had executive chefs in every state and an exec chef in New Zealand, and very varied from small cafes to, we ran the Kitchen by Mike restaurant at Sydney Airport. We ran the Wolfgang Puck restaurant at Sydney Airport. So, really varied job. but I was in a shirt and suit jacket every day. It was pretty different.
What was the sort of biggest or most exciting or interesting gig that you had in during your time there around the globe?
I think the opening. So we opened a bunch of venues in Auckland Airport in 2020. So we had about 6 venues across Auckland Airport. So that was pretty, a really, formidable part of my career was, I had the opportunity to open something like 7 restaurants while I was working for Emirates. And I think opening restaurants is a skill in itself, knowing how to design kitchens for, uses. And they say you need to do 5 before you start figuring it out. So, so I think that was a really eye-opening part of my career. But it was funny though. People were like, "Oh, you'd see your Instagram. Oh, you're traveling so much. That must be so fun." But there was literally times, and I have a lot of family in Auckland, but there was times that I would fly into Auckland Airport on the first flight on Monday morning, and I'd fly out on Friday afternoon, and I'd stay at the airport hotel the whole week, and I wouldn't leave the property. So, so people think it's all fun and games. You actually work way harder, and it looks nice from the outside, but it was pretty full on work. But I really enjoyed those openings.
With such a big sort of role and so many people working for you and different offerings, like Wolfgang Puck or Mike McInerney, which poles apart in regards to food, how do you manage that to get those offerings the way they need to be and spot on?
It's just coming down to building the team. You have to kind of employ the right people on the ground to lead those teams, and then the team under them to support them. And if you don't get it right, it becomes obvious really quickly. And it's very hard to, my normal default when I was running other venues is that something goes wrong, you just go in and fix it. Now, if something goes wrong in Perth and I'm in Melbourne, you can't just drive over there and fix it. So it's employing the right people, putting them to work and leaving them alone most of the time. So not completely. You need to be there to support them. You need to kind of have all the procedures and checks in place. But if you hire the right person, the best thing you can do is kind of get out of their way in the nicest way possible, if that makes sense.
How did you feel in that period of time? You lost your job and you didn't work for another 6 months. You moved north to where it's sunnier. But how did you feel about your place as a chef in hospitality sort of moving forward, given what was happening around the globe?
The first part of COVID, I struggled massively with. I had a good job. I was happy in my job. I had no intention of leaving. As far as I knew, I was doing a good job. And to have that kind of completely ripped away without any, from any repercussion that you've done yourself, right? It's kind of easy to process if you've made a mistake and that gets taken away. But, it was all gone so quickly. Not to mention, I'm not going to get into politics too much, but I did feel like the government didn't handle that particularly well, and I'm not going to get hung up on vaccines and stuff, but the way that the hospitality workforce was treated was tough. Like our workforce was predominantly Nepalese and Filipino guys and girls that, were on student visas and on casual contracts, and to have to tell them that they don't have a job tomorrow and that there's nothing we can do to help them was tough, really hard. So it took a while to process that, to be honest. But we got there in the end, and you can kind of see why now that there's still a massive issue in the industry with labour. It's because we burnt so many of these fantastic, hardworking people that they're not going to come back. Because why would you? It's so it was pretty devastating to see that part of COVID. Process it, and then the realization that this isn't going away anytime soon, and I'm not going to get a job in Melbourne, because there was just no jobs, right? So yeah, we had made the decision pretty quickly just to pack the cars up and go. We were really fortunate, we have Caitlin's family's all here, so we were able to do that. But it's it was a pretty crazy 6 months. It all kind of started kicking off, and then the next minute I'm living in the Sunshine Coast. It was pretty crazy to process. So there was a deliberate, decision to not kind of jump into a job. I needed to process it. I needed to take some time off and, recalibrate what was going on. And that's when the whole kind of content thing kind of came to fruition.
Well, let's talk about that sort of moment, when you started Andy Cooks. Like, these days you look very comfortable in front of a camera, but what was it like originally for you?
Yeah, it was incredibly tough. It's not natural, I don't think, for anyone to talk to a camera. I think it's easier now than it was, 10, 20 years ago. There isn't a huge, when I started, there wasn't a huge production crew. It was just me and a camera and a tripod. But I think the hardest part is that when you start putting yourself out there online, the criticisms that you get. And, I'm a big fan of food from all over the world. And then when people kind of go after you and say, oh, you haven't done that right, it can get a little bit upsetting. You kind of work through it because the last thing I want to do is upset or insult any culture or their food. I want to represent it as best as I can. But there's, you look at like lasagna, there's hundreds of recipes of lasagna and everyone's nonna makes it right and none of them are wrong and they're all delicious. So, that was probably harder to work through. And then you kind of realize that if you've done your due diligence, you do the best you can with the ingredients that you have at hand and you mean, genuinely behind it, then that's all you can kind of do.
Tell us a little bit about your food as a chef. Do you have a dish or two that exemplifies sort of what your cooking was like before you had this shift?
I think I struggled with my style for a long time. I think growing up as a chef in London, I always thought that the only way to be a successful chef was if you did fine dining degustation menus that, had 10,000 components and took half a week to prep. And it wasn't until my into my 30s that I realized you can be a good chef and just cook delicious food that people want to eat and can share. And I think often chefs get caught up and end up cooking food for their chef mates as opposed for the public. So once I realized I should just probably cook what I want to cook, and that is usually like a slow roast lamb shoulder with, a nice, like a tomato salad or maybe some roast potatoes or something like that, and just put your heart and soul into making that as good as you can. It really kind of changed my life as a cook because it was like, all right, this food's good. It's tasty. There's nothing wrong with it. Be proud of it. So, I think that kind of sharing style, for lack of a better term, almost kind of Ottolenghi style of salads, and that's the stuff that I love, and that's what I cook when I'm cooking for my friends and family. So.
Let's talk about the sort of food that you cook. You said you had to get a handle on sort of doing the home cooking, but how would you describe the food that you cook now for what you do with Andy Cooks? It's trying to inspire people to cook better food at home that's achievable. So I don't try and post stuff that's unachievable. Sometimes that might be a bit more advanced for the average home cook, but I try and just do stuff that's approachable and that most of my audience can have access to those ingredients. So most of my audience is in Australia and the US. We've pretty much got very similar access to ingredients, so it's just trying to keep within those boundaries and not get too crazy with it, and inspire people just to cook something different or answer that famous question that everyone asks at 4:30 was, what's for dinner? This sort of shift, that you've had in your career from professional chef to sharing food for people to view, has it changed your views on the power of food and the way that you view food as well?
Yeah, I think it has. I think it's definitely. I think we don't understand food culture very well down here in this part of the world. And I think there's a lot of cultures, India, Pakistan, Italy, the Spanish, who have a much better and healthier relationship with food. And they take the time to stop, enjoy the simple things and talk about food. And that's why they're so passionate, and that's why they kind of get in the comments, and argue their points. But I think, when we talk about food culture here in this part of the world, it's vastly different to what food culture is in a lot of the world, where it is, it's far more cherished and far more respected. And whereas we're only young, aren't we, down here? So we kind of don't quite have that history.
You mentioned research involved in dishes, and you're learning all the time by the sounds of it as well before you're doing these videos to sort of deliver the best thing that you can. What's been the best sort of dish or learnings that you've had along the way?
I think just the understanding that in most cultures and in most really famous origins dishes, that there's still no right or wrong way. We just recently travelled to Vietnam to really try and go deep on banh mi, and the truth is about banh mi, it was a bunch of Cantonese style roast pork and roast meat shops that thought, well, actually, I'm just going to get one of these baguettes that the French brought over and sell this as well. And there's so many versions of a banh mi. It's not just cold cuts and pate. And I think there's a real misunderstanding often about all these famous dishes that we know, that we think that's how it's done. But when you actually go to these places, it's often quite different to how it's been replicated here. And that's just as a result of, migrants coming to countries, not having access to the same ingredients, but wanting to cook their food. So they kind of just do the best they can with the ingredients they can get their hands on.
You mentioned the trip to Vietnam. This thing that you're doing now has taken you all over the world. What's been the sort of the best experience that you've had traveling off the back of this? We
were in the Philippines not long ago as well, and we went to a place called Cavite, it's about 45 minutes out of Manila, and we ate at a restaurant in loose terms called Restaurant da Kitina A, and it was this mother and son who had this restaurant basically in their backyard, and they were I guess you could call them well off as far as as Filipinos, but I said to them, why do you have this restaurant? Like, they clearly didn't have to do it. And they said, we want to cook this food, this traditional food, for the kids who A, don't have access to it and can't afford it, and B, so they understand our history and our history of food. That kind of ties in really well to what we were just talking about with food culture, that this mother and son we're cooking this food for the school kids every day, not to make money, not for any other reason, but then to preserve their culture. And it was, of course, it was like an incredible meal, and unbelievably unusual, like stuff that you just would never have thought of cooking, and like a dish made with papaya and a cow's pancreas, and a lot of people were thinking, that sounds disgusting. I can assure you it was absolutely delicious. Well,
you've had the most unusual and incredible shift in your career. What do you love about what you do?
I think it's those experiences, and building a community of like-minded, passionate, foodies. I hate that word, but I guess it is what it is. From all over the world, and I've met all these incredible people, and very, very fortunate that I now get to travel the world, and I kind of just do what I love now, and I research food, I cook food, I film it, and I put it online, and it usually gets received well. So I think it's so different from where I thought my life and career would go, but very much enjoyed, and very thankful, and feel very fortunate.
Well, Andy, it's an absolute honour to hear just a part of your story today and Deep in the Weeds. Please keep in touch. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more from you, but we'll catch up again soon.
Thanks very much.
This is the Deep in the Weeds podcast. I'm Anthony Huckstep. Stay tuned as we take a deep dive into the lives of the incredible people who ply their trade in the food and hospitality sector. Special thanks to executive producer Rob Locke for making this all happen. Follow us on Instagram at Deep in the Weeds Podcast, or email us at podcast@deepintheweeds.com.au, and be well.